The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene has always been shrouded in mystery and speculation. Since the early centuries of Christianity, theories about a possible romance between them have been debated, fueled by biblical and apocryphal texts that suggest an unusual closeness. In this video, we will explore the evidence and theories that support the idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene could have been more than just teacher and disciple. Mary Magdalene is a fascinating and complex figure in the history of Christianity, especially when we analyze the historical and cultural context of the first century. To better understand her importance, it is essential to consider the position of women in Jewish society at that time. In the first century, women were often seen as second-class citizens. They occupied an inferior position compared to men, often treated as property of their husbands. For example, a woman's word held no weight in court, and her loyalty was expected without reciprocity from men. Imagine living in a world where you couldn't be approached by a man even for a greeting. Furthermore, women were isolated during meals, often eating in separate places from men, and their social interactions were rigidly controlled. This was the reality of the time, and it makes the role that Mary Magdalene played in Jesus' ministry even more remarkable. Mary Magdalene was not just a follower of Jesus. She was among the women who played crucial roles in his ministry. Jesus challenged social norms by including women in his circle of disciples. Have you ever stopped to think about the impact of that? Mary Magdalene was one of the first to witness the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, receiving the mission to announce this news to the disciples. This choice by Jesus is revolutionary, considering that he entrusted a woman with the most important task, to communicate his resurrection. It is interesting to note that Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the resurrected Jesus. In a context where women's voices were often silenced, this position is extraordinary. Why did the early church decide to silence these voices in later narratives? This is an intriguing question that leads us to reflect on the role of women in religious history. Moreover, many associate Mary Magdalene with prostitution, but this is a misconception that has developed over the centuries. In fact, she was healed by Jesus before she became his follower, which further highlights her importance in his ministry. In the Gospels, she is mentioned 17 times, more than many apostles, demonstrating her prominent role in the Christian narrative. Jesus' ministry included many women, challenging the social norms of the time and promoting a model of equality that was radical for those times. However, after Jesus' death, women's voices were gradually silenced in the Christian narrative, leading to the marginalization of figures like Mary Magdalene. Now that you know a bit more about Mary Magdalene and the context in which she lived, we want to hear your opinion. What do you think about the role of women in Jesus' ministry? Do you believe Mary Magdalene should have more prominence in Christian narratives? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. Like this video to reach more people on the platform. Subscribe to the channel. Your participation is very important to us. Mary Magdalene, whose name suggests she was from the village of Magdala, located on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, played a fundamental role in the life of Jesus. The first contact between them is described in the Gospel of Luke, where it is narrated that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her. This number is not merely symbolic. In the culture of the time, the number 7 represented completeness. Thus, Mary's healing not only freed her from a state of torment, but also transformed her into a devoted follower. Have you ever thought about how this experience must have shaped her life and faith? After this transformation, Mary became one of the women who accompanied Jesus on his journeys, helping to sustain his ministry with her resources. This indicates that she not only had an active role, but also possessed a certain economic status. It's fascinating to imagine how a wealthy and influential woman could challenge the social norms of the time by joining a predominantly male group. At the most crucial moments of Jesus' life, Mary was present. She was one of the witnesses of the crucifixion, and according to the Gospel of Mark, she saw where Jesus' body was buried. But what truly makes her special is that she was the first person to find the empty tomb after the resurrection. This responsibility is monumental. Imagine being the first to receive the most impactful news in Christian history. He has risen. How would you feel to be chosen for such a mission? Furthermore, in apocryphal texts such as the Gospel of Philip, Mary is referred to as Jesus' companion. This Greek word, koinonos, carries a profound meaning and may suggest an intimate relationship that goes beyond friendship. It's interesting to think about how this interpretation could change our view of Mary Magdalene and her role in the history of Christianity. Finally, there are legends surrounding the figure of Mary Magdalene, including stories about her life after the events narrated in the Gospels. One such narrative claims that she preached in France after being forced to leave Judea. This story adds a mystical touch to her narrative and shows how her figure has been venerated over the centuries. Knowing this about Mary Magdalene and her role in the ministry of Jesus, we want to know what you think. Do you believe she should have a more prominent place in Christian narratives? If you'd like, you can leave a comment below. The figure of Mary Magdalene is surrounded by mysteries and misunderstandings, especially when it comes to the myth that associates her with prostitution. This idea, which has spread over the centuries, has no basis in Scripture and is based more on misconceptions than on facts. Let's explore the true story of Mary Magdalene and how she became one of Jesus' most loyal followers. Mary Magdalene is a symbol of transformation and faith. Her story teaches us about the power of healing and redemption, showing that everyone has the potential to change their lives regardless of their past. As we reflect on her journey, we are invited to question prejudices and recognize the value of women in religious history. What surprised you the most about this important disciple? Do you believe we should reevaluate how women are portrayed in religious narratives? The feminine revolution promoted by Jesus is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of his ministry. At a time when women were frequently marginalized, Jesus challenged social norms by including women in his circle of disciples and recognizing their importance in crucial moments of his life. This inclusion not only transformed the lives of the women who followed him, but also laid the groundwork for a model of equality that was radical for his time. From the beginning of his ministry, Jesus demonstrated deep respect and appreciation for women. In the Gospel of Luke, for example, we find a narrative highlighting the presence of various women who followed Jesus and supported him with their possessions. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna are just a few of the women mentioned who dedicated themselves to supporting Jesus and his disciples. Imagine the scene. A diverse group of men and women traveling together, sharing experiences and resources, challenging the norms of the patriarchal society of the time. This was not just a social change, it was a true revolution. Women were present at crucial moments in the narrative of Jesus. They witnessed his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, occupying roles that were often overlooked in later traditions. While many of the male disciples distanced themselves out of fear, the women remained steadfast by Jesus' side, demonstrating extraordinary courage. Have you ever thought about what that means? These women were not mere spectators. They were active participants in the story of salvation. One of the most notable aspects of Jesus' ministry was his willingness to heal and restore the dignity of women. He approached them with compassion and respect, as in the case of the woman with the flow of blood, whom he called daughter. This simple word not only restored her physical health but also her social dignity. In a world where women were often seen as inferior, Jesus treated them as equals, showing that everyone is worthy of love and respect. Furthermore, Jesus often used examples that included both men and women in his teachings. He told parables that spoke about widows and maidens, illustrating profound spiritual truths through feminine experiences. This inclusive approach not only captivated his audience but also challenged the social norms of the time. The impact of Jesus' ministry on women was profound and lasting. By entrusting Mary Magdalene with the mission of announcing his resurrection to the disciples, he not only recognized her importance, but also gave her a central role in the Christian narrative. This choice is especially significant considering the limited value ascribed to female testimony in the society of that time. In doing so, Jesus laid the groundwork for a new understanding of the role of women in the Christian community. This feminine revolution was not limited to the time of Jesus. Its implications echo to this day. The message of the gospel is a call for inclusion and equality, breaking down barriers that often separate men and women. As we can see in the letters of the Apostle Paul, this idea was further developed. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. As we reflect on this feminine revolution initiated by Jesus, we are invited to consider how these lessons remain relevant today. What can we learn from the example of inclusion and respect that he established? How can we apply these principles in our own lives and communities? Reflection is essential as we continue this important conversation about equality and inclusion in the current context. After the death of Jesus, the silencing of women's voices in the Christian narrative became a gradual, yet impactful phenomenon that led to the marginalization of figures like Mary Magdalene. This transformation was not merely a matter of omission. It was a deliberate process aimed at reconfiguring the image of women within the religious and social context of the time. Mary Magdalene, who was one of Jesus' closest followers and the first to witness his resurrection, saw her significant role overshadowed. In the canonical Gospels, she is mentioned as a strong and devoted woman, but over time her image was distorted. Pope Gregory I in 599 AD contributed to this change by characterizing her as a sinful adulteress and possessed, associating her with the figure of the repentant prostitute. This construction not only distorted her true story, but also perpetuated a stigma that spread for centuries. Have you ever paused to consider how this transformation affected the perception of women in the church? Gnostic texts, which were deemed heretical by the official church, presented a different view of Mary Magdalene. In these writings, she was often depicted as a spiritual leader and an interpreter of Jesus' doctrine. Her presence in these texts was so significant that it provoked jealousy among the male apostles. For example, in some dialogues from the apocryphal Gospels, Peter expresses his discontent with Mary, stating that she takes away all our opportunities to speak. This rivalry reveals the discomfort that female leadership caused in an emerging patriarchal system. As the church consolidated as a formal institution within the Roman Empire, women's voices were increasingly silenced. The testimony of women began to be systematically excluded from accounts of early Christianity. While male figures like Peter gained prominence and authority, Mary Magdalene and other women were relegated to secondary roles. The exclusion of women from leadership and decision-making spheres was not only a matter of theological interpretation, it was a strategy to reinforce a patriarchal model that dominated society. This marginalization was not limited to the figure of Mary Magdalene. It reflected a broader trend of silencing women's voices in the history of the church. The construction of Mary as a sinner served to justify the exclusion of women from religious leadership and perpetuate the idea that they were inferior to men. This narrative became so entrenched that it led to the creation of lasting stigmas about the role of women in religion. In recent years, however, there has been a growing movement to reevaluate the role of Mary Magdalene and restore her image as the apostle of the apostles. Scholars and theologians have worked to highlight her importance in early Christianity and challenge the patriarchal narratives that have dominated for so long. This reevaluation is crucial not only to honor the memory of Mary Magdalene, but also to recognize the value of women in all religious traditions. Now that you know more about the subsequent silencing of figures like Mary Magdalene, we would like to hear your opinion. What do you think about the role of women in religious history? How can we work together to ensure that women's voices are heard and valued in contemporary religious communities? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. Your participation is essential to this important conversation about equality and inclusion. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene remains a fascinating and controversial topic, filled with varied interpretations. While many texts suggest a deep connection, the historical evidence remains ambiguous. This debate not only provokes reflections on the life of Jesus, but also challenges established norms regarding the role of women in religious history. In the end, the question remains: What do we really know about the true relationship between these two emblematic figures? The story of Mary Magdalene and the silencing of women's voices in the Christian narrative invites us to reflect on the importance of inclusion and recognition of the contributions of all people, regardless of their gender. Throughout the centuries, the marginalization of figures like Mary Magdalene not only obscured her true importance in the ministry of Jesus, but also perpetuated a patriarchal model that still resonates in many religious traditions today. However, as we begin to reevaluate these narratives, there is a valuable opportunity to restore the dignity and central role of women in the history of Christianity. Mary Magdalene's legacy as a spiritual leader and witness of the resurrection serves as a powerful reminder that faith and leadership have no gender. By recognizing and celebrating women's voices in religious history, we can pave the way for a more inclusive and equitable practice in contemporary communities. This reevaluation not only honors the women who came before us, but also inspires future generations to strive for a space where everyone can be heard and valued. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to receive more interesting content like this. See you in the next video.